again, I'll introduce myself again. I'm DeGuzman. I'm the producer of engagement programs at Geva Theater Center, and in January we started something called Geva Insights, which is an attempt to go beyond the script into the world in which the plays reside. And this world is 1834 China and the United States. And so I looked around and did some research, and I found Dr. Elya Zhang, a professor at University of Rochester with expertise in this area. And one thing that really drew me to her was she just a specialist in history, but she also was a specialist in economics.
Economic history.
Economic history.
Yeah,
right. So, I mean, and that seemed to be very relevant here. I mean, it began with a financial transaction where she was basically leased or sold a family. And so I wanted to talk more about that with Elya, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. Yeah, and thank you for the introduction.
Thank you.
That really set our expectations. So, guys, it's all downhill from here.
So I think we talked a little bit about what we wanted to discuss before, and we talked about starting with the economic conditions and the trade relationship in China, between China and the United States in 1834 when Antoine was 14.
Yes, so in year 1834, so we'll have to look at it from China's point of view and the American point of view. Because when we talk about Sino-US trade, we're thinking about American export to China and also Chinese export to the United States. Yeah. And they are in complete different situation at that time. So long ago, there was this idea of what we call the fabled vast Chinese market. Yeah. Since Marco Polo's time, China has been known as the most populous country in the world. And then in years 1834, in the Chinese census, the Chinese population reached 400 million. Yeah. And that's where that number stick, the 400 million customers. Yeah. So since just from the very beginning of the nation, the nation of the United States, as early as 1784. Yeah. And so the very first ship, which was founded by Baltimore merchants, is called Empress of China, sailed. And at the time, just to finance that ship, and $120,000 was spent to build the vast ship, and also to gather the goods that's going to be sold to China. And I want to give you a concept about what 120,000 meant in 1784. So in year 1784, for $5, you can buy 1 acre of good land in the South. So we are talking about just the finance, the money that was spent on this voyage can buy 24,000 acres of land in American South at the time. Yeah, it was quite an enterprise. And it was co-funded by 4 of the richest men, the richest merchants in Baltimore at the time. And luckily for them, the voyage was successful. And after 1 year, it turned around, it sailed on the birthday of George Washington. Yeah, and then after 1 year, it came back with a 30% profit. In other words, $30,000 profit. And from there, it kick-started this dream. Yeah, this dream, and also the very romantic age of the old China trade. Generation of American merchants, they went east, and then they come back with fortunes. And I can name a few. For instance, the Forbes family, the entire Forbes family, and then also the great-grandfather of John Kerry, later the Secretary of State. And then also maternal grandfather of FDR. Yeah. So both families, their money came from China. But when we get to 1834, something started to shift. That is, the critical age actually started to come to an end. The romantic age, which started from 1780. By the year 1830s, it already came to the tail end of it. We'll finally roughly end in 1844. Yeah, in 1844. And so it ended there. And why? There's several reasons. The reason is that for the original families, most of them from Baltimore. Most of them from Boston, and some of them from Baltimore. The money has been made, yeah. So for them, they are wrapping things up, and then essentially they are moving the money to the United States, and particularly they are investing in the trans-regional transportation, the canals and the railways, and new things there. Yeah. So the Connors brother who brought her here is belong to what we call the second generation. Yeah, second generation there. Would you like me to talk about like their different pattern of trade?
Yeah, I think I would. I'd like to, let's situate Afon Moy in this trade. Yes, going back and forth.
So then the first generations for them, what they ship to China then is opium, yeah, and then silver, because China, silver is precious metal, yeah, and then so it's a commodity in the United States, it's mainly in China. So opium, silver, ginseng, and later flour, yeah. Then when you get to the second generation, the Connors brother generation, yeah. And then what they did is what we call a two-front strategy. One thing is almost a prototype of later, 100 years, 200 years later, made in China. That is the Connors brother. One of them is based in Paris, and then the other based, in New York. So the one who based in Paris, and then they will try to find the most fashionable object. And then the one who later based in China is going to find cheap Chinese labor to mass produce it, the cheaper version of it, and then export it to the United States, even with the label sometimes they're made in France. Yeah. And that's the bulk of their commodity. But on the side, they also started a new business, which is they try to ship, smaller and light object, exotic object, including spectacular firework, and then fan, and then painting, Chinese toy. Yeah. So that's where our farm essentially was imported as a piece of commodity among their couples. Yeah.
Was she meant to be promotional, or was it in keeping with the whole idea of those human zoos that were popping up, where they had exotic people, or was it both?
I think it's both. On the one hand, she was bought as a piece of property, yeah, a piece of commodity. And meanwhile, you can see that the entire farmship, yeah, the room is a display room to sell. That's why she toured around 15 states. Yeah, and then essentially I counted, I drew an American map. I realized it's almost the only state on the East Coast she didn't set foot in is North Carolina. Yeah, and then she went all the way to Cuba. And in each place you can see the cargo went with her, the room went with her. The room was set up, she was sort of displayed, and people got interested in her, and then they started to purchase the commodities that she represents. Yeah.
One of the things that was very interesting in the play was how they situated what was happening with her and with Chinese people in this country to what was happening with other immigrants or the internet, the slave trade, and then also the genocide of Native Americans, indigenous people here. So all of that was happening at the same time, and she was aware of it later, but at the beginning she wasn't aware of it. So I mean, it just showed how isolated she was from the world.
Yes, and then coincidentally, that when she was going to Cuba, when she went to Havana, and on the same ship, there were the native Indians who were put on stage. Yeah, and then who was also on the same ship, there were native Indians who were literally being exiled out of the American continent. And also around that same time, the tribal leader of the Black Hawk people, were also were forced to put on stage. Yeah, to be on display.
Can we talk a little bit about the situation Afon Moy came from in China, where her father, about her bound feet? I think that was a curiosity. We talked a little bit about that when we were preparing for this conversation, but also about him leasing or selling her to what was the situation where a father would do that with his daughter?
Well, so first she is one of the 7 children. And then in year 1830, so when you actually look at the local history of Guangdong at the time, and you saw famine, yeah, you saw famine, you saw flood. But actually there was one elephant in the room, is opium addiction. Yeah, so from her we can see that, she's a delicate lady. Yeah, she's a delicate lady, and she has bound feet, and then meaning that she was not meant for manual labor. Yeah. And then also she can speak, she speaks Cantonese, means that she's from the south. So we can imagine that the situation is likely, it can be caused by famine, by flood, or it simply can be just a family is squandering its fortune, because of the opium, addiction there.
And they may have told her parents that she'd come back too.
Yes, it was supposed to be 2 years. Yes, and then so the opium addiction at the time it started, and then I think it's the opium war is actually about tea. Yeah, it's about tea. The British East Indian Company, was exporting Chinese tea, but without anything to export to the Chinese. So eventually, what they did is they found out one thing, which is opium, and it started in the 1810s, and then they have promotion packages. They put opium in small, tiny packages and freely distributed among residents. Yeah, eventually the country, 1/4 of the country got hooked, especially in the southern region. And then I think I can imagine probably that's likely where Antoine more come from. Yeah.
Now in the play, and I'm not sure if it's, how accurate it was, but in the play she spoke of her family as she spoke of herself as being quite highborn. Is that realistic, or is that something that was part of the mystique that she created around herself here?
I think that's part of the mystique. There was a book called A Chinese Lady, written by Nancy Davis, published by Oxford Press in 2019, in which a former curator of the Smithsonian Museum chronicled Antoine's life. And so in that book, the historians really went back to digging the sources. The sources that she probably not as highborn as promoted. That the highborn, we call it, is almost like a princess. The princess image was part of the selling strategies. It was more an image that was conjured up by the Thomas brother than herself. Yeah, but yes, but it's clear that she's not, she's not from local. She's at least middle class. Yeah, back in her hometown.
And what would a middle class life been like in her town in 1834?
So, middle class life in 1834,
in China, in her province.
Well, there's one thing. One thing is I think they will have a servant. Yeah, they have a servant, and then from her family that it's not. The foreigners are still not very common. This is before the Opium War. This is actually 6 years before the Opium War, which means that China was still under the Canton system. That the entire Chinese coast was closed except for one port, that is city of Guangzhou. That's why it's called the Canton system. And then about 13th, merchant house, imperial approved merchant house, they monopolize the trade, and the foreigners can only deal with this 13th merchant house. So the fact that Antoine Moy was even went out of Guangzhou means that her family, is probably either in the merchant rank, or probably a comfortable, or probably in that circle which actually they was exposed to foreigners.
So maybe that's how they met the Carnes.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And then so in details, there's also a ship captain, and she mentioned there was Augusta Miss there. Yeah. So that lady actually went into Guangzhou, and then escorted Antoine out. So when the Carnes brother, when she got Antoine out, what they try to do is they try to export a lifestyle. Yeah. And then what we call the Chinese lifestyle. And so lifestyle now we're not talking about daily utensils here, more like a decorated items, as you can see from the wall there. So that's why it's very important to portray her as the exotic Chinese lady, and so that to sell the lifestyle that she comes with. Yeah.
We talked about in our conversations about she being the first Chinese woman in the United States. How accurate is that? And talk about why that was.
Mm-hmm. I think that's actually quite accurate. Yeah, because the earliest in 1830, the record it showed that there are a total of 3 Chinese in the United States. So we are talking about that's 1830, 4 years before she came in. And then the fact that the ship captain, his wife, actually had to went in Guangzhou, broke a number of laws and tried to sign her, release her out. And I think it is very likely that she is probably the first Chinese woman. Yeah, that's set for the American soil, all American soil, yes.
And then fast forwarding to when Chinese men came here, why no women?
There's something, you probably noticed the monologue of Antoine there. So, yeah. So in the end, he said the most forbidden. He said the most forbidden is actually, the act between me and Antoine. You think that there's a Chinese man, there's a Chinese woman, and then that actually becomes the most forbidden act. And numbers don't lie. look at numbers, yeah. When you look at numbers, and then if you just trace the number, so I went back to trace the number. I tried to know exactly roughly from year 1934, and then all the way to year 1834. Yeah, sorry, 1834, yeah, and then to the year of Exclusion Act at 1882. Roughly each year, how many Chinese men were admitted through customs, and how many Chinese women were admitted through customs. Yeah. And then throughout, you can see that the ratio, in some years is literally 1 to 1,000, and then that's bad year. And then in some good year, like the best year, we can see that it's about 20 to 100. So in average, at the end of the day, each year, in average, for every 100 Chinese men, admitted, there will be probably only, 1, 2, 3 Chinese women that were admitted. So yes, there is a gross imbalance of gender ratio among Chinese in America.
Which indicates that they needed the labor from Chinese men, but they didn't want a permanent Chinese citizenship in the United States, so no families.
Yes, and then so this is there is a series of acts led to it. The Chinese Exclusion Act is notorious, the most famously known. But I would like to bring your attention to 2 incidents before it. One is the 1830, the census, the U.S. Census of 1870, and then the other is what we call the Page Law of 1875. So we start with the 1870s. By 1870s, it's already small. It's already like too many men and too little women. But the census at that time, what it did is that it literally labeled 53% of the Chinese women who were already in the United States, labeled them as prostitutes when it comes to occupation. Yeah. And meanwhile, if we actually look at the same number about what we call the European women, or European female immigrants, the majority of them were labeled as dressmaker, while the Chinese women were labeled as prostitute. So this census actually provided ammunition for 5 years later for the passing of the Page Law of 1875, which was specifically targeting Chinese women. Yeah. One of the architects of this law was Judge Lorenzo Soil, and he was actually Chief Justice of California from 1868 onward for a few years. So he had a famous quote. He said, literally asserted this. He said, if they, means the Chinamen, if they don't bring their women here, they will not be able to multiply. Yeah. If the Chinamen don't bring their women here, and they will die like a worn-out steam machine. And when they die like a worn-out steam machine, they don't have any children to fill their space.
So it's social engineering.
Yes, yeah, it's just like eugenics, right? It's like a form of social engineering, yeah. So this Page Law, 1875. So what did they do? Essentially, it says that it didn't say no Chinese women, but it said you will forbade any Chinese woman to enter the United States for lewd or immoral purposes. So in application, what happened is first this law was zealously enforced in Hong Kong. Yeah, because everyone who left China first, they have to get a certificate from the American Consul in Hong Kong. Yeah. So in there, first they have to undergo 3 rounds of interrogation. Yeah, in which to decide their value. And you can already imagine how many people were weighed out. Yeah, through that process, especially for those who could not speak English. And then finally, when one get a certificate, yeah, and then they got on the ship, and then they spent an entire month sail across the Pacific, and then arrived San Francisco. The other ordeal began. In the port authority, they have to prove themselves again. Yeah, they have to went through another round of interrogation. Yeah, try to prove that they are virtual. So in that process, already hundreds of them will just return back because they were decided that they are not virtuous. In theory, that they have a right to appeal. Yeah, so some of them they try to resort to legal means, try to appeal, but there's substantial court fee. Not many people can afford it. And even when you can afford it, in court, yeah, and this was actually written in record, And they were publicly ridiculed by the lawyers, by witnesses, and sometimes by the judge themselves. Yeah, essentially laughed out loud. Yeah. So after this kind of process, so many people, they actually returned. It created a vicious cycle. Yeah, vicious cycle is that you don't even bother to come. Yeah, that's why when we get to the page law really, play a crucial role in forbidding Chinese women from coming. Yeah, because when you actually look at the numbers, you suddenly see that after 1875, the number of Chinese women coming to the United States every year is almost in a single digit. Yeah, it's almost in a single digit. And meanwhile, the page law it even required the vessels to be detained. In other words, if a vessel will come in with a Chinese woman, and then a Chinese woman will detained at a port, the entire vessel will be detained. Now, then the result is that people don't want to carry Chinese women in. And then they also charge exorbitant fee. They only charge $40 for men to carry them from Hong Kong to San Francisco, but for women they will charge $400. Yeah.
So going back to the play,
Yes.
she did not live to 200. I think she lived to her. I think that she was when she left the Barnum Museum, I guess they called it, or the circus that we knew as a circus. What options would have been available to her? It's kind of a catch-22 situation. You're not supposed to be lewd or do things that, but if you have no options to survive, my understanding is she disappeared.
Yes. So historically, so the play is a beautiful story. Yeah. So it started as 1834 and then go to 1864. In reality, that she vanished after 1851. The last record of her is in February 1851 when she was on a newspaper and said she's part of the show. And then the P.T. Barnum show. So in that show, she was in, chronologically speaking, that she was at employment of the Connors brothers from 1834 to 1837. And then after that, the brother went bankrupt for various reasons. And so she stayed in a pool house in Mammoth County, New Jersey, for about 8 years, and then wandered around a bit. By late 1840s, and she was discovered by the P.T. Barnum there, and then she was on display together with the famous Town Clown, yeah, and then the Great Monkey Man, and also the 430-pound Ohio Lady, yeah, as one of the human curiosity there. But the last record of her is February 1851. Yes. So that's after that she vanished. Yeah.
I want to switch gears from the Chinese lady, even though that's the name of the play, to Antoine.
Yes, Antoine. Yes.
Antoine, because he said a lot. Even though even though she said he was irrelevant, which he became less irrelevant over the years as she became more dependent on him. But what would his story? So he says that he was brought here as a child, or he started traveling as a child, and he had traveled a lot before he came with the Kerns.
Yes.
Can you talk about? I mean, I know that I didn't see a lot of history about him, but just about someone like him who would have come over and had been hired. There weren't a lot of opportunities for him outside of the work that he did either, right?
Yes. So first, when he learned his English, I try to think very hard, and then my educated guess, yeah, is that because I think he probably was working for one of the missionaries in China, yeah. Because when we look at it, the history of Americans in modern China, the first one is always merchant first, and then missionary follow, and then a flag. In other words, it's the merchant will rise, the first step in China. But just 2 years after the sale of the Empress of China, and then the first group of missionaries arrived at China, and there they run small schools. Yeah, and I suspected, that Antoine, probably was educated. That's where he learned his English. But then after 1851, after 1851, what were his options? And one of them can be the Transcontinental Railway. The Transcontinental Railway was constructed, between 1861 to 1865. Yeah.
But in the play, he was depicted as is frailer and more elderly than the average worker on the railroad at that point, right?
Yes. So then, the options. One is manual labor, farm labor, and then the swamp of California need to be drained, and then the plantation need to be built. So almost 80% of the laborers who work, in California plantation at the time were Chinese. And then also there are servicemen, laundry, restaurant, vegetable peddlers, and then so roughly there's casinos sometimes. So those are the limited choices that you might have.
And very limited on the East Coast.
Yes, very limited on the East Coast. Yes.
And in 1864, there were still slaves. So I mean, even the manual labor, a lot of the labor force in the East Coast was black.
Yes, and then also there's also something for disadvantages for the Chinese is that when the Transcontinental Railway was built, we know that the railway was built by two companies and then two groups of laborers. Essentially, the Central Pacific, they built from Sacramento. They started from Sacramento and then they built toward east. And then meanwhile, the east, another railway company, they hired Irish laborers and they built from east to west. Finally, the two companies met in Utah. So it was at that moment that you can imagine that thousands of Chinese laborers, they were at that point, in Utah. Originally, they were promised a ticket of return to California. That was part of the hiring package. That was part of the promise. The promise actually was not kept. As soon as the railway was completed, and then the Central Pacific laid off all the Chinese laborers. And now, their salary could not even afford the very railway they built. And then so the Chinese, the thousands of Chinese were like overnight, they were jobless and homeless, and then stuck in the middle of the United States, right in Utah there. So what they did is that they dispersed. They went up, they went down, they went south, they went east, they went everywhere. And the result is they all tried to just make tiny living, somewhere else. But the downside is that they are completely isolated. That's why in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there were a number of massacres, against, organized massacre against the Chinese people because they're so isolated in each town there.
And there's a lot of propaganda, negative propaganda against the Chinese at that time.
Yes. So we probably can also even sense from the play that where, the Chinese men and women being complete split. The women became an almost exotic object. And the men were almost portrayed as subhuman. Subhuman there. And the Chinese men, they're not family men. They don't have feelings. This is some of the lines you're actually so being spoken.
Drug addicts.
And yes, and all is portrayed.
Or depicted as drug addicts.
Depicted, yes. So then the Exclusion Act is 1882. And what are his options? At that point, if we look at the law, that passed starting from California and later to nationwide, Chinese in general, I'm talking men and women, but mostly men, here, they were not allowed to attend any public school, means they cannot even receive any education, and few people can afford private education, so they cannot get educated. They are banned from public school of any sort. They are banned from owning land, and they are banned from owning any real estate. And lastly, in 1870, they banned from getting any business license. So then, as Judge Lorenzo Sawyer said, so most of them die like worn-out steam machine. And then as machine, they don't have children. They don't have children to build it.
Or they don't have children by Chinese women.
That's actually very interesting. When you actually look at the history and you see intellectual, you see quite some example of interracial marriage between a Chinese man and Irish woman.
And black women.
Yes, and black women.
Because from a status standpoint, there are a lot of African American families or people in this country that have Chinese ancestry, and it was probably had a lot to do with.
It also has to do that the Transcontinental Railway, they really left them in the middle of the country.
Right.
So they really just went out and started their own adventure.
So we're gonna wrap up, but I really wanted to offer you had so many thoughts on this play and so much deep knowledge. Wanted to offer you the opportunity. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to share that was sparked by the play, or just in general about the context of the play?
Oh, I'm actually more curious about like what the audience think. I wonder if the audience has anything to share or any questions.
Well, we really don't do that with Geva Insights. I think we can do it with a couple. I mean, if there are a couple of questions, if you can stand up and speak loudly, because of COVID, we're not going to share our mics.
Yeah, or
But
then any information that I can provide, any piece of the history that
Sure.
I can gather. Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming tonight, because I didn't know about this presentation until this morning, and then got tickets, so I really enjoyed the performance.
Thank you.
My question, and it's a question about Antoine. The ship, you get the impression that people landed by ship in New York or Baltimore, or always San Francisco? Did they come essentially from Hong Kong to San Francisco, and then she had to take a carriage, or however you would get from San Francisco to New York City?
Oh, at the
Can you
time.
explain how that would work in the 1830s?
Yes. So 1830s they have to went through the Caribbean. They have to go through the Caribbean because the transcontinental railway was not built.
Right.
Yeah. So that's it. So her route is, I think she arrived in San Francisco, and then she had to sail south and then cross the entire Caribbean island and try to get to New Orleans and then continue to go out.
Going around the Horn? And do we have any, there's no Panama Canal yet, right?
No. Yeah.
So we've got to go all the way around South America.
I think at some point she probably took the land route just to cross that
Yeah.
narrow strip there. Yeah.
I have a question for you about that, just based on that. So it seems like if she probably left when she was 13 then, or 12. I mean, just from a time perspective.
This is also one thing I would like to slightly, because I still think that the play is beautifully written. Yeah. And sometimes, when I put on my historic hat and I say, oh, there's some facts a little bit off there. And so it's likely that when she starts not 14. Yeah. And I think as early as it's probably between 16 and 19. Yeah. And then, I personally think it actually tend to think it's probably toward the 19-year-old side. Yeah. And so, how long it take? Yes, it takes 10 months to sail across the Pacific Ocean. And then it will take a month, just to try to cross the continent there.
And she was probably coming with the goods.
Yes.
I mean, on the same ship with the cargo.
Yes, the cargoes, yes.
Mhm.
So just a little bit more about the Exclusion Act this time, and that is that did that actually force the creation of what we refer to later as Chinatown, San Francisco, also in Toronto, also in New York City? Very important and large coming together of the populations.
Yes, the route, as I say, to try to find that safe route. Yeah, and then, so because the Exclusion Act, it was established in 1882, it was renewed in 1892, and essentially after 1892, it was made permanent. And then in year 1905, there was another U.S. Supreme Court and ruled that any Chinese, even if at that time you are already American citizens, if you leave the country, you cannot return. You will be denied entry, so nobody dare to even leave. Yeah. And this Exclusion Act was not repealed until 1943. And only until 1948 that finally Chinese were granted the right to own property in the United States. Yeah.
And just another comparison too of her being on display, and the whole idea of human zoos, and the last human zoo closed in 1958
Where?
in Belgium. In 1958. I mean, it's just crazy how recent all of this history is, and I think it's impactful to how things linger, how things repeat, because it's such recent history. that I don't think most people learn. I mean, I guess I'll ask a show of hands, how many people in middle school or high school learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act? So it's one person.
Wow. Thank you, sir.
And one more question, and then I think we have to wrap. If there's another one.
I'm interested in other Asian countries at the time when the gold was found. Did they do the same thing as Chinese to immigrate to America?
And I will make this very quick. I know we're running out of time. Yeah, so essentially when we look at waves, Chinese was the first wave, Japanese was the second one, Korean was the third one, Filipino was the fourth one. Yeah, so
The first.
The fourth. The one
The
that's-
way, well,
Yeah,
the first,
wave.
I think the first Asians in the
Yes,
US were
in terms of
Filipinos.
Asian, yeah, it's Asian
Were
countries.
Filipinos.
So then first the Chinese come in, especially after 1848 because of the gold rush. Yeah, and then also the transcontinental railway. Then 1882, Exclusion Act was set in place. Chinese laborers cannot come. But the America was expanding, as a great nation. It's still in need of cheap labor. So the Japanese fill in that niche. That's when the Japanese emigrated out of Japan. And first they got to Hawaii, and then working most of the pineapple plantations there. And then they moved. After Hawaii became a part of, became the states. And so they moved to the mainland. But then the Japanese was banned.
I just have to say the Filipinos were in Hawaii too at that time.
Yes.
I mean, because my husband's father was in Hawaii from the 1930s.
1930s.
And became a citizen when it became a state.
Yes.
So he became a citizen in 1946, I guess.
Because the Japanese were banned after 1920. Yeah, after 20. And then the Koreans, come in. But the numbers of Koreans not large enough. So later the Filipinos and then Indians, Pakistani, and people from Bangladesh, it's a wave of cheap labor from Asia arrived. Yeah. All as the aftermath of the 1882 Exclusion Act.
Right. And that's why so many people don't have roots beyond 1960s. I mean, the 1960s that are in that last wave of Asians who started coming. I mean, the first wave of Asians after the Exclusion Act was.
Yes. So when you look at the number, again, we look at the numbers, when you look at year 1900, 20 years after the Exclusion Act, so you see a total number of Chinese there, but when you look into it to see how many of them are native born, like only America, just 8%. Yeah, only 8% of the Chinese in America were born in the United States. All the others are essentially first generation. And that's a direct, result of the patriarchy. Yeah, when the women, were allowed.
I have one question about that. Was it a higher percentage, but just people were in hiding, sort of, too, not really coming forward for the census? Do you think the number was greater?
I think the number is definitely greater. Yeah,
At that time.
and then also because everyone has to pay a $25 coolie tax, no matter what, as long as your name sounds Chinese. Yeah, and that's a large sum for a lot of people at the time. Yeah.
I thank you all for staying and talking to us.